America is not heading toward a recession in the way most people imagine it. This will not arrive as a single headline, a single crash, or a single moment of panic. It is arriving quietly, unevenly, and state by state. While national numbers still look passable on the surface, the financial fuse underneath the country is already burning. The United States now carries more than $38 trillion in debt, and the interest alone is consuming over $1 trillion every year. That money does not disappear. It crowds out spending on infrastructure, healthcare, education, and emergency support. When the economy slows, states with weak balance sheets and narrow revenue streams feel the pressure first. This is why the next recession will not hit everyone equally. Some states will bend, others will break. What makes this moment dangerous is how misleading the headline data has become. GDP can rise while households fall behind. Job numbers can look stable while wages quietly lose. To inflation, tax revenues can appear healthy right up until consumer spending slips and the floor drops out. By the time the pain shows up in official announcements, the damage is already locked in. This is not a theoretical warning. Housing markets are already stalling. Commercial real estate is hollowing out. State budgets built on optimistic assumptions are starting to strain. The recession most people are waiting for is already visible if you know where to look. And here's the part few want to talk about. Some states are showing advanced symptoms right now. Their populations are shrinking, their tax bases are thinning, and their financial obligations are growing heavier by the month. The breakdown is not evenly distributed, it is geographic. Stay with me until the end, because the states ranked number 3, number 2, and especially number 1 are already flashing signals that usually appear much later in a downturn. If you live in one of them or are thinking about moving, this information matters more than optimism. Subscribe and hit the bell because this channel tracks economic risk before headlines admit it. A recession does not collapse a state all at once. It moves through a predictable chain, quietly at first, then all at once. Everything begins with a revenue shock. When the national economy slows, consumer spending drops, corporate profits thin, and investment retreats. For states that rely heavily on sales taxes, capital gains, tourism, or a single dominant industry, that slowdown hits budgets almost immediately. Once revenue weakens, layoffs follow. Companies tied to discretionary spending, construction, finance, energy, or technology start cutting costs. Those job losses are not isolated events. They ripple outward. Fewer paychecks mean fewer home purchases, fewer renovations, fewer nights out, and fewer taxable transactions. This is where the gap between national averages and local reality widens fast. As layoffs spread, state tax, collections fall short of projections. Income taxes shrink, sales taxes soften, property tax growth stalls as housing markets freeze. Yet expenses do not decline at the same pace. Pension obligations remain fixed. Debt payments remain fixed. Infrastructure costs remain fixed. Something has to give. That pressure forces service cuts, hiring freezes, school budget reductions, delayed maintenance, and cuts to healthcare and public safety begin appearing. Quality of life erodes slowly, then suddenly. Families with options start leaving. Businesses follow talent. Population loss reduces the tax base further, deepening the imbalance. This is how outmigration turns a slowdown into a spiral. As residents leave, housing demand weakens. Prices stagnate or fall. Municipal revenues drop again. Credit ratings suffer. Borrowing costs rise. States that entered the downturn with high debt, aging populations, or underfunded pensions find themselves trapped, rolling over obligations with shrinking resources. Some states are far more exposed to this chain than others. Heavy reliance on one industry, fragile tax structures, older populations, climate-related costs, and aggressive borrowing magnify every shock. By the time headlines confirm a crisis, budgets are already broken and exits are crowded. If you live in one of these states, subscribe and hit the bell. This is what budgets will not warn you about. Understanding this mechanism early can mean the difference between resilience, preparation, and being trapped later. Number 15, Washington is often held up as a model of modern prosperity, powered by technology, global trade, and innovation. On the surface, it still looks stable. High incomes, major employers, and strong headline growth suggest resilience. But underneath that image sits a dangerous concentration risk. The state leans heavily on a narrow band of industries, especially technology and aerospace, while housing costs have raced far ahead of what most residents can sustain. When tech hiring slows or global demand weakens, tax revenues soften quickly. Early signals are already visible in rising housing inventory, longer selling times, and budget sensitivity to consumer spending. Washington's reputation suggests safety, but its structure leaves little margin for error once a recession tightens. Number 14, Alaska, appears distant from the mainland economy, which creates a false sense of insulation. Its weakness is simplicity. The state depends overwhelmingly on oil revenues to fund services and support employment. When energy prices fall or demand weakens, there is no buffer. Living costs are among the highest in the country, while population growth has turned negative. Younger workers are leaving, shrinking the tax base. With reserves drawn down and limited diversification, even a mild national downturn creates immediate fiscal stress. Alaska looks calm, but its economy swings violently with forces it cannot control. Number 13. Louisiana carries the illusion of strength through energy production and port activity. Yet household incomes remain low, poverty rates high, and public finances strained. Climate exposure adds constant financial pressure through storms, flooding, and insurance costs. The state relies on volatile industries while struggling to retain residents and businesses. As energy investment slows and disaster costs rise, budgets tighten fast. Early breakdown signals appear in outmigration, insurance shocks, and stagnant job growth. Louisiana's economy looks productive on paper, but resilience is thin once conditions worsen. Number 12, Arizona still benefits from migration and construction narratives, but the cracks are widening. Housing affordability has collapsed after years of rapid price growth, while wages lag behind. Water scarcity introduces a long-term constraint that directly impacts development, agriculture, and property values. As borrowing costs rise, foreclosure activity increases and construction slows. Population growth is already decelerating. Arizona's boom created momentum, but momentum reverses quickly when affordability and resources collide. Number 11, New Jersey projects wealth through proximity to major markets, yet its underlying structure is fragile. High taxes, massive public debt, and underfunded pensions weigh heavily on residents and businesses. Outmigration continues as households seek relief elsewhere. The state relies on finance, real estate, and high earners, sectors that contract sharply during downturns. Housing costs remain elevated while infrastructure ages. New Jersey looks affluent, but the balance between obligation and revenue is already under strain. Subscribe and hit the bell because the next states are where the damage accelerates. Number 10. Indiana has long been viewed as steady, practical, and immune to hype. That reputation is precisely what makes the current stress so dangerous. Manufacturing dominates the state's economy, and when orders slow, layoffs arrive fast. Factory hiring has cooled, overtime has vanished, and small towns tied to single plants are already feeling it. Housing affordability has slipped as prices rose faster than wages, leaving households exposed as hours get cut. Local budgets depend heavily on payroll stability, and once paychecks thin, sales tax revenue follows. Indiana does not collapse loudly, it tightens quietly, and that silence is often the first visible fracture. Number 9, Texas is where the contrast between story and data becomes impossible to ignore. The boom narrative is still everywhere, yet oil revenues remain volatile, tech hiring has slowed, and housing inventory is climbing across multiple metros. Rapid population growth stretched infrastructure thin, from power grids to water systems, leaving little buffer for disruption. When energy prices dip or construction pauses, tax collections wobble. Austin's housing pullback is no longer isolated, and rental markets across Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio are softening. Texas grew fast on momentum, but momentum reverses quickly when costs rise and demand hesitates. Number 8, Nevada shows what happens when an economy depends on people spending money for fun. Tourism and hospitality drive employment, and when visitors pull back, job losses stack rapidly. Hotel occupancy has slipped, gaming revenues are under pressure, and construction pipelines are thinning. Housing markets that once surged now stall as buyers disappear. Investors retreat first, then workers feel it next. Nevada has lived through this cycle before, and the early signs look familiar. The state appears vibrant until spending pauses. Then the cracks spread everywhere at once, revealing how narrow the foundation really is. Number 7, Hawaii is where stress turns unmistakable. Tourism dominates the economy, and rising travel costs are already suppressing demand. Visitor numbers soften while living. Costs remain extreme for residents who have little room left to absorb shocks. Housing prices sit far beyond local wages, forcing families to leave in growing numbers. Population decline shrinks the tax base just as infrastructure, healthcare, and disaster costs rise. Insurance pressures add another layer of strain. Hawaii's beauty masks a fragile structure built on visitors and high prices. When tourism slows, there is no alternative engine to absorb the shock, and the consequences compound quickly. Subscribe and hit the bell because the next group is already bleeding, and the pattern only accelerates from here as the downturn deepens. Number 6, New York sits at the center of America's financial identity, and that makes its vulnerability far more dangerous than it looks. The state relies heavily on Wall Street, commercial real estate, and high-income earners to fund public services. As office buildings empty and remote work hollow out downtowns, property tax revenue shrinks fast. Financial sector layoffs don't just reduce jobs, they erase income tax streams that budgets depend on. At the same time, pension obligations and long-term debt remain fixed, refusing to shrink with the economy. People are already leaving, taking spending power with them. Once population loss accelerates, the math turns unforgiving, and New York's ability to sustain its obligations begins to crack. Number 5, Delaware appears calm only because its economy is small. That scale is precisely the problem. The state depends heavily on corporate registrations and financial services, a narrow tax base that performs well only when markets are expanding. In a recession, corporate activity slows, filings drop, and revenue disappears almost immediately. Delaware has little diversification to absorb that shock. Housing costs have risen faster than wages, squeezing households with limited employment alternatives. Outmigration may seem modest in raw numbers, but for a small state, it hits harder, faster. Once businesses pause and residents leave, the fiscal gap widens quickly, leaving lawmakers with few tools left. Number 4, Maryland feels protected because of proximity to Washington, but that dependence is exactly what puts it at risk. Federal employment and contracts drive a large share of income across the state. When national budgets tighten, hiring freezes and contract delays ripple outward immediately. Meanwhile, housing prices remain elevated while commercial real estate weakens, creating a tax imbalance. Pension liabilities continue to grow, and infrastructure costs rise regardless of revenue. Residents notice the pressure first through taxes and service quality, then through affordability. Population flight doesn't start loudly here, but it starts deliberately, one household at a time. Subscribe and hit the bell because the top 3 are already entering crisis territory, and what happens next will reshape the economic map faster than most people expect. Number 3, Illinois, is what systemic stress looks like when it's allowed to compound for decades. This is not a state reacting to a recession, it is a state entering one already weakened. Unfunded pension obligations loom over every budget decision, locking lawmakers into payments that grow even when revenues shrink. Commercial real estate values in Chicago have fallen sharply as offices sit empty, draining a tax base that once funded schools, transit, and public safety. Corporations are not just downsizing here, they are leaving, taking high-income jobs with them. Population loss accelerates the damage, because fewer residents means fewer taxpayers supporting the same fixed costs. The danger in Illinois is inevitability. When markets tighten, there is no flexibility left. The numbers don't bend, and the consequences arrive whether leaders are ready or not. Number 2, California proves that size does not equal safety. On paper, it's one of the largest economies on Earth. In practice, it is increasingly brittle. The state depends heavily on high earners, real estate transactions, and technology profits to fund public services. When tech layoffs spread and property values soften, tax revenue collapses faster than most people expect. Downtowns hollow out, commercial buildings lose value, and cities scramble to fill widening budget gaps. Businesses relocate, residents leave, and each departure compounds the strain. Wildfire insurance costs, housing affordability, and infrastructure demands keep rising even as the tax base shrinks. California's scale delays recognition, but it magnifies the fallout. When the engine stutters, the shockwave is massive. You can feel it now in quieter streets, stalled projects, and tightening services. Subscribe and hit the bell because number 1 is already tipping, and what comes next will surprise even those who thought they were prepared. Number 1, Florida is where every fault line we've discussed converges at once, and that's what makes it the epicenter of a potential 2026 collapse. On the surface, Florida still looks vibrant, packed beaches, cranes on skylines, and endless new arrivals chasing sunshine. But underneath that image is an economy balanced on some of the most fragile pillars in the country. Tourism drives a massive share of jobs and tax revenue, and when discretionary spending tightens in a recession, that engine stalls fast. Fewer visitors don't just mean empty hotels. They mean layoffs, shrinking sales taxes, and cities suddenly short on cash to fund basic services. Housing, once Florida's biggest magnet, has turned into a pressure cooker. Years of speculation push prices far beyond local wages, leaving homeowners exposed the moment rates rose. Now add insurance. Premiums have surged, carriers are pulling out, and thousands of residents are discovering their biggest monthly cost isn't the mortgage, it's protection against storms. When insurance becomes unaffordable or unavailable, property values don't gently adjust. They drop hard. Buyers disappear, sellers panic, and liquidity vanishes. That process has already started quietly in multiple metro areas. Climate risk accelerates everything. Hurricanes, flooding, and extreme heat aren't abstract threats here. They are recurring costs. Each storm stresses infrastructure, drains reserves, and raises future insurance and borrowing costs. At the same time, Florida's infrastructure is straining under relentless population growth. Roads, power grids, water systems, and emergency services were built for a smaller, slower state. Maintaining them requires steady revenue growth, yet recession does the opposite. When growth pauses, the math breaks. Job security adds another layer of vulnerability. Construction, hospitality, retail, and real estate employ a huge portion of the workforce. These are the first sectors hit when confidence fades. As layoffs rise, consumer spending falls, feeding back into the tourism and housing slowdown. It becomes a loop that reinforces itself. People who move for opportunity start reassessing whether staying makes sense. Florida shows what collapse looks like in real time, not as a single crash, but as multiple systems failing together. Housing speculation, insurance instability, climate exposure, and revenue dependence all pull in the same direction once the economy turns. Seeing this clearly is the shift. You're no longer watching headlines, you're reading the system. Subscribe and hit the bell if you want updates as this unfolds, because Florida isn't a warning for someday. It's the model for what recession-era state failure looks like when optimism finally meets reality. When you step back and look across all 15 states, the pattern stops feeling random and starts looking mechanical. Different regions, different politics, different cultures, yet the same stresses repeat again and again. Revenue sources narrow just as spending demands rise. One or two industries carry too much weight, and when demand softens, the whole structure wobbles. Population growth slows or reverses, shrinking the tax base while obligations remain fixed. Debt and pension promises don't pause for recessions. They intensify them. Housing stretches beyond local wages, turning affordability into fragility. Climate exposure quietly raises costs every year until one shock makes them impossible to ignore. None of this happens overnight, but once it starts, it rarely reverses quickly. That's the lens I want you to keep. Not fear, not headlines, but a checklist you can apply anywhere. Start with revenue. Ask where the money really comes from. Is it tourism, energy, finance, real estate, or a single employer cluster? Then look at concentration. The fewer pillars holding up a state, the harder the fall when one cracks. Next comes population. Are people arriving for opportunity or leaving for affordability? Migration tells the truth long before politicians do. Then move to obligations. Debt and pensions aren't opinions, they're math. If promises exceed realistic future revenue, something eventually breaks. Housing is next. Compare prices and rents to local incomes, not national averages. When shelter consumes too much of a paycheck, households lose flexibility and economies lose resilience. Finally, climate. Floods, fires, heat, storms, and insurance withdrawals aren't side issues anymore. They are recurring costs that compound stress during downturns. This checklist doesn't predict the future perfectly, but it reveals vulnerability clearly. Once you see these signals, you stop being surprised by outcomes. You recognize why some states bend while others snap, and why size or reputation don't guarantee safety. That shift matters. It moves you from reacting to headlines to understanding systems. Now I want to hear from you. Which state do you think cracks next and why? Do you see these patterns? Where you live? Or are there warning signs you think people are ignoring? Drop it in the comments because these conversations sharpen everyone's perspective. I'll keep tracking the data as this recession unfolds, watching how these indicators evolve and where pressure builds next. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next investigation, because this isn't about panic. It's about clarity, preparation, and seeing the system before it forces everyone else to look.